What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a sewing kit. So let's just get started. Alright, so to start things off we're going to select a cube and start blocking out the main pouch shape. Now I'm really going to just focus on keeping things in low poly. It's going to make my life much easier as I start positioning things and figuring out the proportions of everything. But I'm just going to start off with that main pouch shape for now, and then we can move on to a lot of the smaller things later on. Now this week's video is going to be similar to last week's, more of a time lapse, but I'm going to be talking along the way or jumping in here and there to explain some of the things I'm doing. But I do have plans for more tutorial based videos or tips and tricks and things like that. Just things are still a little crazy over here, so as soon as things slow down and I get a bit more time, I will start making a few other videos. For now, let's just continue on with this sewing kit and let's start blocking some of these shapes out. Alright, so for this left little pocket or pouch, I'm just going to add a few edge loops on the top, and then I can select the face where I want to extrude the little flap or opening to this little pocket. Then afterwards, all I have to do is just create another little cylinder, and I can scale that down, bevel the edge to create one little button that sits on top of the flap. Once again, I'm just going to keep things in low poly. It's really going to help me figure out all of these shapes, and then once we're more happy with how they're looking, I can start beveling some edges and adding some more polys to them. This is also the reference photo I was using. It's from a photo from Pinterest, and I don't exactly know who the photographer was, but it's a photo I really liked and I just wanted to recreate it. I wanted to see what I could do in about an hour or two of modeling. Alright, so next up is adding two straps on the top and the bottom of the pouch. Now I was planning on having a few rolls of thread in between these two straps, and a little piece of leather or some string would be tying them and holding them into place. So similar to how I did the first pouch, we're going to block out another little rectangle on the top and the bottom of this pouch, and that way I can then add those strings or rolls in between them, and then we can tie them into place. So these two straps are going to be different. The top one's going to be sewn into place and just going to be a part of this pouch. And the bottom one's going to be a buckle on the far right side, so you can open and close it to add or remove different thread. So all I'm going to do here is add a few edge loops, and I can start moving those outside faces closer to the pouch so it looks like they're actually attached. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for this bottom strap. It's just going to be attached only on the outsides rather than the whole length along the bottom. So then I can duplicate that same buckle we created earlier and I can attach it to the outside of the strap. Alright, so next up is adding those rolls of thread. Now this is pretty straightforward. I'm going to do this with a few cylinders, and all I'm going to do is bevel those outside edges and then start adding a few edge loops on the outside of the shape. Now it's going to make my life much easier if I can start visualizing where I want that thread material to be and where I want that white plastic that's going to be on the outside of the shape. So those edge loops that I add are going to act as that transition between those two materials. So later on when we start UVing this object, I can just make some simple cuts around those edges so I can just apply that material much easier later on in Substance Painter. Alright, so now that our roll of thread is in place, we can zoom back out and start visualizing how this object is coming together. I'm also going to take that roll of thread and duplicate it a few more times since I know I'm planning on having about 5 or 6 of them laying down in the middle of the pouch. I can start visualizing the scale of these objects and getting the proportions somewhat accurate. So let's start playing around with the shape a little bit more so we can start moving on to a few other things. Alright, so next up we're going to select another cube and we can start blocking out the little leather strap or string that's holding this roll of thread in place. Now we're not actually going to tie this thing in place because that would just be a lot of unnecessary work. So all we're going to do is fake it by just extruding one of these edges to tuck underneath the top strap, and then the bottom one's just going to loop around to act as if it's kind of tied around and holding it in place. Alright, so next up is the right side of the pouch. Now this is going to be the same as the left, so it's going to have a pocket that's on the bottom, and then on the top is going to be another strap that's going to be holding some pins and a measuring tape. So to make our lives easy, since we already created the shapes, we're going to take them and duplicate them over, but just scale them smaller to fit into the area. So let's start off with that strap, and then we can move on to that pocket that's going to sit right below it. Alright, so on this larger pouch shape, there's those two pieces that stick out on the far left, so you can roll this thing together and tie it up to hold it into place. Now I wanted to make it a little bit more realistic, so I wanted to show those two pieces that were sticking out as if it was actually into the fabric itself that was sewn into place. So what we're going to do is just add a few edge loops on this main large rectangle. That way I can create a little bump where those two objects interact, so it looks like it's actually fitting into this piece of fabric. Now I don't need to go crazy in polys here, I'm actually going to keep it relatively low, but once I hit 3 on my keyboard, it's actually going to smooth it out and hopefully I'll get a better result. So what I'm going to start with is just adding those edge loops and then selecting those faces where I want that bump in the fabric to be, and then I can just pull those upwards. Now, once again, working in low polys when you're just experimenting with stuff like this is definitely important. If you add too many polys to the shape, it can actually get very confusing and really quickly things can start falling apart. So we're gonna focus on just keeping things in low polys, and that can start creating that little bump in the fabric where these two objects are gonna be sewn together. Alright, so we need a small buckle or a button on the end of these straps. That way we can close this pouch and roll it together if we had to. So very similar to the other ones, we're going to create another small cylinder and then scale that down and fit it into place. Alright, so now our main shapes are complete, we can start adding the small little details. So we're going to start off with the measuring tape. Now this is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to keep this thing once again in low polys. I'm going to start off with a plane, and we can bring down all of those subdivisions so they're at 0. And then we can start extruding one of those edges so we can wrap around that top strap that we have. Now I don't want to spend too much time on this shape and have to wrap it around this object and make it look super realistic. So to make my life a little bit easier, we're just going to wrap it around once, and then I can take that shape and duplicate it once more or twice more and scale it down very small to fit inside of this original shape. That way we can give the illusion as it's wrapping around, but in reality it's just going to be a few small planes or faces that are just wrapped around to look like it's a long measuring tape. Now since I'm modeling this shape in a really low amount of polys, it's going to have some hard edges. So what we're going to do is hit 3 on my keyboard as I'm modeling the shape, just so it can give me a more realistic view of how it's going to look once it's complete. So once I'm happy with everything and it's in its final state, I can go ahead and smooth out this object. That way it's going to add a bunch of polys to it, and it's going to make it look nice and smooth and hopefully more realistic to what a measuring tape would look like. Now since these measuring tapes are probably quite thin, it's not going to be really thick, so we're just going to keep it one-sided, and hopefully you're not going to be able to tell once we jump into Substance Painter. Alright, so our measuring tape is complete. Next up are those little pins. So I just jumped on Google Images and I found a generic pin as some reference, so we're going to model it off of something like this. So I'm going to start off with selecting a torus, and then I can chop this thing in half and start modeling out the one end of our pin. Now I definitely spent a little bit too long on this shape. The thickness was really throwing me off. I just had to jump back and forth with deciding how thick I wanted that front of this pin shape to be. But either way, we ended up getting it done. So let's just continue blocking things out until we get it into a little bit more of a shape that I'm happy with. Alright, so now that we modeled our pin, I can go ahead and scale this down to fit onto that strap. Now I would recommend going ahead and UVing this ahead of time. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to duplicate it a bunch of times and just fit them into place. But this is just going to be a little bit of extra work for myself because eventually I'll have to just remove all of them and then reposition them all. So I would definitely suggest just UVing this before you start duplicating. Either way, let's go ahead and start positioning these pins on our sewing kit. Now I really quickly noticed on the end of my pin the coil wasn't touching. In real life they're actually quite close, basically touching each other, and that was going to bother me since I just wanted to make this a little bit more realistic. Now I probably should have just remodeled this from scratch, but in this case, just to save myself a little bit of time, I decided to go in, just select some of these edges, and I can just move them closer together. Now this is definitely a little bit of a sloppy approach to doing this, but it's a quick fix. And to be honest, it's really small in our scene, so you're definitely not going to notice it. So just to save myself a lot of time, we're just going to go ahead and quickly modify this shape. Alright, so those pins are complete. Now we can zoom back out and I can start just tweaking some of these shapes a little bit. Alright, so next up are adding a few small buttons. So right between that small pocket and the thread, I want to have sewn on a few extra buttons. So this is pretty straightforward. We're going to start off with creating a plane. It's going to act as if some little paper or piece of plastic or something that's holding those buttons onto the pouch. And then for the buttons themselves, I'm just going to create a cylinder and I'm going to increase some of those caps so I can start visualizing where I want those little holes in the buttons to go. Now if I could go back and change a few things, one of the things I would do is add a few different variations of buttons. Since I just modeled one and I just duplicated it 4 times, I would go back and add a few different ones, and I think it would help the objects look a little bit more interesting. Alright, so now that I have most of these objects blocked out, I'm going to jump back to that first pouch we created and I can start adding a few extra polys. So firstly, I want to create a little seam that runs around the outside. Later on in Substance Painter, I want to add some stitching effect, so I want to create a little bump that's on the outside. So I'm going to start adding a few edge loops so I can start positioning where I want those seams to go. Once I have those edge loops in place, I'm going to start beveling some of those hard edges. Now I don't want to go too crazy and add a ton of polys to my scene, but this model was planning to be a little bit more realistic, so I definitely want to bevel those hard edges. I'm also planning on smoothing out this object once I'm finished, so I'm going to keep hitting 3 on my keyboard so I can see how that smooth object is looking as I start tweaking the shape. And once again, I'm not going to worry too much about topology or worry about getting everything perfect. I just want to work on that rough shape, and then once I'm happy with it, I can go ahead and clean things up. Now you'll notice how I first started extruding that thin outside edge along the outside of the pocket. I was originally planning on having that thin border on the outside and then having those stitches sit right on the inside of that extrusion. But near the end of the model, I quickly decided to change things up. I just dragged those edges a little bit closer in so I had a thicker border around the outside. Also, because this is going to be a fabric material and I'm planning on adding a few wave or fold effects into the fabric later on in Substance Painter, I don't need to worry too much about getting everything perfect. In fact, I actually want it to look a little crooked. Those imperfections are actually going to work in my favor because it's a fabric material. I don't want things looking straight and looking perfect because in real life it probably wouldn't be. So I'm going to try to use that to my advantage and not really stress and worry about getting everything perfect. I'm just going to continue playing around with the shape until I get into a state that I'm happy with. Alright, so I'm just going to continue on to all the other objects that have that fabric material. I can start adding a few edge loops where I want that outside border to go. Alright, so I just jumped forward ahead a little bit so you didn't have to see me do the same thing over and over, but like I mentioned earlier, I made the outside borders on all of these fabric materials a little bit wider. So I went through and added a couple edge loops to all of these shapes, and I made that little fabric material act as if there's a little bump on the outside borders. So I also thought it would be a little bit more realistic if I added my own wave effect into the geometry. So we're going to do that as well in Substance Painter in the material, but I thought if we can add both, it would just add a little bit more realism. So all I'm going to do here is with my soft select brush by hitting B on my keyboard, and I can hold B down and click and drag to change the radius. I can go ahead and select these vertices and slightly lift them or lower them so I can create my own wave effect. Now I'm not going to go too crazy here, I'm just going to do this very slightly and subtly. Just adding that small little detail will hopefully add a little bit more realism. Alright, so now that I'm happy with my fabric material, I can go ahead and jump to some other objects in my scene to help finalize them. We're going to start off with those rolls of thread and those little pieces of leather that are holding them in place. So all I'm going to do here is just bevel some of those hard edges. Alright, so next up is creating a little pair of sewing scissors. So to start things off, I'm going to create a torus to act as the small loop where your finger goes through, and then I can extrude some of those faces to create the longer edge where the blade's going to be. Now I really didn't know how I wanted to tackle these pair of scissors. I just jumped on Google Images and found a scissors reference image, just a generic pair that I could model it after, and then we could just fit those into my scene. Now, this isn't going to be the center of attention or the main piece in this whole model, so I don't want to spend too much time getting these perfect. I just want to really quickly get a generic pair of scissors into place, and then we can just position those on top of my pouch. Now I was definitely trying to rush things. I really didn't want to spend too much time on these scissors, but it definitely backfired on myself, and sometimes if you try to rush things, you end up actually spending more time than you originally probably would if you took your time and planned things out properly. Either way, they're small in the scene, and it turned out pretty good, so it is what it is. Alright, so those scissors are finally complete. Next up is that little piece that sits over your finger. I think this is to stop the needle from pricking your finger, but either way it tends to be in these sewing kits, so let's go ahead and add one. So to do this, we're going to start off with a cylinder. I can go ahead and bevel one of those edges to have a rounded out edge, and then I can hollow it out and give it a little bit of thickness. And then once we have that small object in place, we can go ahead and duplicate a few of those pins we already created, and I can just move them over to this side of the scene. I just thought adding a few extra pins will hopefully make the scene look a little bit more interesting. Alright, so that's all of the modeling. Now we're going to quickly go over how I did those UVs. Alright, so here's the model in its finished form. Now what I decided to do was break this thing up into two different groups for the two different textures that are applied. So on the very first group is the pouch, and that's all of the fabric material as well as those tiny little buttons. So I will quickly go over what I did, and I do the exact same thing for every shape. So I'm just going to duplicate this one object over so I can show you. So all I started with was a camera-based projection. That way it's going to remove all of the cuts on my model and I can start with a clean canvas. Once I have that done, I can go up to my 3D Cut and Sew UV tool, which is right over here at the top of my screen. And I can right click, go up to Component, and then click Edge. Now everywhere where I click on an edge, I'm going to create my own cuts into the model. Now it's up to you wherever you like to create your own cuts, but I like to do them along edges or areas that you probably won't see where those seams are. So for example, on a shape like this, I would do it along the edge. So I can basically cut this model into two. So if I go over to my UV editor, and it's usually right up here at the top of your screen, I can right click and go to UV shell, and I can select both of those UV shells and go Control U to unfold and Control L to lay them out. Now it's always good to rotate them in your UV editor to take up the least amount of space on your UV map. So once those are rotated, I can select them both and go Control L once again to lay them out. So now if I hit checkerboard on the top of my screen, you'll see how I'm getting no stretches and everything looks nice and smooth. So that's the exact same thing I would do over and over again for every object. So one of the things that I did do when I broke these objects into their own groups was prioritize each shape. So for example, the bottom of this pouch is not going to be in view, so I can actually scale this nice and small and move it off to the side. So by the time I'm done UVing all of my objects, I know I can prioritize the larger shells that are actually going to be in view in the final render. So for example, the bottom I don't need since you're never going to see it. However, if you were planning on rolling this thing up or animating it or it being used in a video game, then you'd probably prioritize the outside. In this case, I'm not going to, and it's just going to save me space. So let's go ahead and delete this and go back to my original shape. You'll see that that's exactly what I did. The bottom is taking up a much smaller space in my UV map, whereas the top is taking up as large of an area as I can. So that's exactly what I did. I broke this thing up into two, so the other is just all of the objects in my scene, so the scissors, the thread, and the pins, and so forth. Once again, for this guy, all I did was I gave each thread their own space. Since they're going to be different colors, if they're overlapping, I won't be able to have different colors on each thread. And I also did that for the leather straps. Now, because they're so small, you'll see you probably won't be able to notice in the renders, so I probably could have kept these things overlapped. Either way, I decided to give them their own space. And another thing I did was for this measuring tape, Since a lot of these pieces are underneath and you're not going to see them, they don't need to be as large as the top faces on this object. So I prioritize those, so when I add that detail and that text in Substance Painter, they're hopefully going to be a little bit more clear since they're larger and they're taking up more space, whereas these things are not going to be in view, so they don't need to be given any priority. Anyways, I hope that helps explain some of my UVs. There will be future videos where I actually go through the full process, but I thought it would save some time since it's the exact same thing with every model. So to go over that really quickly, once again, I started with a camera-based projection to remove the cuts, and then using that 3D Cut and Sew UV tool, I can go in and create those cuts wherever I want on my model. And the very last step would be just adding some materials. So you have to make sure that you add a material to each group. In this case, the pouch has pouch texture and objects has objects texture. And once again, remember to delete all your history, which I didn't do. It's always important before you export your models. Alright, so now that we went over how exactly I did those UVs, now let's jump into Substance Painter so we can quickly start texturing. Alright, so now in Substance Painter we can go ahead and load in our FBX file from Maya. Once that's loaded in and everything's looking good, you can go over to your texture set settings, scroll down to Bake Mesh Maps, choose your output size, I chose 4K, and make sure to check on that use low poly mesh as high poly mesh since we only have one mesh to work with. Everything else is good to go, you can just go ahead and start baking out your textures. Alright, so to start things off, we're going to go select our pouch texture in our texture set list, and we can start texturing our pouch material. So starting off in my materials tab, we're going to go ahead and select that fabric rough material as our base material for our fabric. I'm just going to scale down this texture by sliding that tiling slider, and then I can just tweak the colors until I find something that fits my model. Now I'm not going to worry about getting it perfect right off the start, I just want to get it into a generic color that I'm happy with, and I can always just tweak it along the way. Now I don't know if you can tell, but the direction of my fabric is showing vertical on my little pockets and is going horizontally on all my other objects. Now I want that to be consistent, so once I'm happy with it, I can right click, set it to a black mask and assign it to those specific shapes, and then I can just duplicate that same material over again, unassign it from everything and assign it to my other materials. The only thing I have to do is just change the rotation so all the fabrics are lined up in the same direction. Now this can be easily avoided just by changing the orientation of your UV shells in your UV map, but because I was lazy and I really didn't plan it out, we're just going to have to do it this way. So things were looking a little bit too clean, so I want to start adding a little dirt and grunge. So all I'm going to do is add a fill layer, and I can go over to my masks tab, and then depending on whatever grunge and dirt effect you want, you can just drag that directly onto that fill layer. So that's all I'm doing here. I'm just going to add a few different fill layers and add a few different masking and dirt effects. That way I can add a little bit of grunge and dirt on top of that material. Now it's important not to go crazy with just one dirt and grunge effect. I always find you get more realistic results if you slightly start adding different layers and different effects very gradually, and then you work your way up by just combining those different dirt and grunge details. Alright, so now it's time to add some stitches. Now thanks to Substance Painter, this is fairly easy. We're just going to add another fill layer, and I can go over to my brushes and scroll all the way to the bottom until I find a procedural stitching brush. Now this brush is great. All you can do is just tweak some of these settings depending on how you want your stitching effect to show. But we're just basically going to use the settings that come with Substance Painter. We're just going to shrink them down a tiny bit so I have some smaller stitches, and then I can start drawing on my mesh wherever I want that effect to go. Now it's important just to go down to my height slider and drag that down or up depending on the bump effect I want to have in my material. In this case I'm going to drag it up since I want that stitching effect to show like a bump. And then like I said, I can start drawing along the seams of all of my shapes. Now I'm going to be using my mouse, but if you had a tablet and you could just draw them on yourself, you could probably get better results. But I'm just going to draw these lines all over my model so we can add some nice stitching. Alright, so now that we have our stitches applied, I'm going to go to our Smart Materials and select that bronze armor so we can apply it to those small buttons. Now really quickly before we move on to our objects texture, I thought that the pouch was looking still a little bit too clean. So once again we're going to add another fill layer, and I'm going to add a few more dirt and grunge effects on top just so I can make it look a little bit more dirty. Alright, so now it's time to jump to our objects texture. So I decided to start with one of our rolls of thread. So I'm going to select the fill layer. I'm going to go choose one of those colors. So I decided to choose red thread. And once I'm happy with that, I can right click, set it to a black mask, and assign it to that UV chunk. Now since we made those cuts on each end of the shape, it's easy for me to apply that material to that thread. So now we need to find some sort of effect for that thread itself. So I'm going to go over to my textures tab, and near the very top of this list there's this great material that's called anisotropic noise. It looks like some line sort of texture, but it crosses in on itself, and I thought this would be great to use as some sort of thread-like material. So we're going to click that and drag that onto our height channel, and as you can see it creates some sort of bump effect, but it's still not looking quite right. So what we're going to do is select that fill layer that I already have applied. I'm just going to duplicate it and slide it directly below. We're then going to remove that effect we have assigned to the height channel, and I'm going to scroll to the very bottom and find the stripe texture effect, and I'm going to drag that onto the normal. And then I just have to change the orientation so it matches the other effect that's on the height channel. Now this is going to add some sort of double lined effect, and I think it's going to look a little bit more realistic when we jump into the renderer. We just have to change the scale and the tiling so they're really small to act as some sort of thin thread-like sort of texture. And I'm just going to increase the roughness and the metallicness since that thread material tends to be quite glossy and reflective. And then we can quickly jump into our renderer to see how things are looking. Now as you can see, it looks quite different from our editor in our renderer, so that's why it's nice to jump back and forth to see how things are looking, because they don't always look the same. And while we're here, I'm going to really quickly raise that floor so it matches the bottom of our model. I'm also going to scroll up and change the environmental light. I don't want it to be an outdoor scene, so I'm going to go choose one of those studio lights, and that's going to dramatically change the look of the material. Since it's not like a dusk, dawn, sunset light on it, this is just studio lights, so it's looking much brighter. So I'm going to jump back to that pouch texture so I can tweak those colors and bring it down a little bit to make it look a little bit darker. And while we're here, we can start tweaking some of the other effects we already have on it, like some of that dirt and grunge. And I also want to add some sort of folding effect as well. So in the Smart Materials, there's this fabric flannel texture. So we're just going to copy that over, and I can open up that folder, take away those folding effect that's in there, and I can just paste it on top of my list. And then all I have to do is just tweak some of those settings. I don't want it to be so obvious and look really wrinkly, so I'm just going to drag down that opacity so you can barely see the folding effect, but it's definitely going to add a little bit of realism to that fabric material. And once again, since the orientation of our pockets and our main pouch is different, we're going to do the exact same thing by only assigning it to those specific meshes and then duplicating it over to reassign to the other pocket meshes, just changing the orientation so the fabric materials are all going in the exact same way. So now jumping back to our objects texture, I'm just going to copy over that same thread material we created for that red thread. I'm just going to duplicate it over and just change the color to blue, white, and a few different others so I can fill in the other pieces of thread. Alright, so next was just the white plastic that's around the thread, and then that's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to go choose a plastic smart material and assign it to that mesh. And then same thing with the leather straps. I'm going to go choose one of those smart materials and assign it to those straps as well. Alright, so next up was the measuring tape. Now I quickly jumped on Google and found just a generic measuring tape image, and I'm going to drag that into my project as an alpha, and then all I need to do is just create a layer, and using the projection tool I can just project that image directly onto my mesh. Alright, so for the rest of these other small objects, I just use random smart materials that come with Substance Painter. So we're just going to go through and select various materials and we can apply it to the remaining meshes. Alright, so now all of our objects have materials applied, so now I can unhide everything, zoom back out, and take a look and see how things are looking. Now usually at this point things need a little bit more dirt and grunge just to make it look a little bit more realistic. I want this thing to look used, not like it's brand new, so we're going to continue adding a few extra small dirt and grunge effects on top of the ones that are already there. Now for some reason I thought it would just be cooler to add my own ambient occlusion onto the material itself. I know we could always do that in post and Photoshop, but I thought adding it directly into the mesh itself would just make things look a little bit better. So all I have to do is add a fill layer, and I need to make sure I add an ambient occlusion channel. So I need to go to my texture set settings, hit the small plus icon, and make sure I add an ambient occlusion to my channels. Then I can go back to that ambient occlusion that I searched up in my library, and I can drag that directly onto my ambient occlusion channel, and then depending on how much of effect I drag my slider, I can add my own ambient occlusion directly onto my material. It's just going to make the areas around my pouches and my objects a little darker, and I thought it would just make it look a little cooler. We're also going to continue adding some small little dirt and grunge effects as well, so once again adding more fill layers, we can go back to our masks tab and then choose whatever masking effect to keep adding some more dirt and grunge and layering on those effects. Now I'm just going to speed up this next little bit as I'm adding these other dirt and grunge effects, because I'm kind of experimenting along the way and clicking and dragging on different ones to see how they look. And then once I find something that I think is fitting, I'll just go ahead and start tweaking that a little bit more to blend in with the other materials and effects. Now, like I usually say in a lot of these videos, this tends to be the longest part of the whole video. It's just the end when you're tweaking things and making those small adjustments. I really find that the longer you spend in this last portion, you can really make some major improvements with your model just by looking in the render and jumping in and out and making those small adjustments. So that's exactly what we're going to do. I don't want to spend too much longer on this model, but there are a few things I want to tweak. So let's go ahead and just make those small adjustments and then we can wrap up this model. And that's basically it. That's the whole modeling, texturing, and UVing process that I did to create this sewing kit. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. And if you also feel like supporting the channel even further, as well as get access to additional content, check out my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. And as things slow down and as we get a little more settled in this new house, I am planning to actually start uploading more frequently again, especially to my Patreon page, which I know I have neglected, so I do have lots planned to make up for this missed time. Anyways, thanks for all the support and thanks for tuning into this week's video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.